Hey everyone, welcome back to TCF Speaking Lab. Today's topic falls under the category of technology and we are going to work on a very common TCF Task 3 question. Le téléphone portable est-il indispensable? But before jumping to the response itself, let's quickly review the structure that we always follow. This is a 5-step response. Starting with an introduction, then come 2 main arguments. This is where we use our blueprints, examples, and short explanations. After that, we add a counter-argument, and this is very important because at the B2 level, the examiner expects you to be able to consider different perspectives of the topic. Let's take a look at the template that I personally use. I don't want you to read the text right now. I simply want to show you how much of the response is actually reusable and made up of fixed sentences. Everything written in blue represents fixed expressions, connectors, and sentence structures that can be reused for probably 90% of TCF topics. On the exam day, you are already dealing with stress and time pressure, and the last thing you want is to waste energy thinking about how to start your response, how to transition between ideas, or how to conclude. If these parts become automatic, you can focus on what really matters. And what really matters are the parts that fill the gaps. All right, let's start with the introduction. Ignore the fixed text for now. We'll cover those parts later. Just look at what I fill the gap with. Les technologies and le téléphone portable. Basically, the subject itself. As you can see, the introduction can often be built directly from the wording of the question, the topic itself. The second and third paragraphs are where the real work happens. These are the parts where we actually need to generate new ideas and build meaningful sentences. For this, we need what I call blueprints, the actual arguments and examples we can use. And the more topics you practice before exam day, the more blueprints you build. And in other words, your pool of ideas become richer, and which significantly reduces the chance of freezing or panicking during the exam. The fourth step is the counter-argument, and a good counter-argument usually highlights a limitation and introduces a balance to the discussion. For this section, we typically need to generate only one single sentence, and the rest follows a fixed structure. And finally, we have the conclusion, the easiest part. This is where we wrap our response. Most of the time, we don't even need to create a completely new sentence because our conclusion templates work perfectly well for a wide range of topics. So when you look at a task 3 question, don't think that you need to invent the whole response from scratch. You don't. You're simply filling a few gaps with ideas that fit the topic. So at the end of the day, you see that you only need 3 to 4 new sentences on the exam day. If you have built a few solid blueprints beforehand, let's say under each category, that's more than enough to handle most of TCF topics with confidence. All right, now let's start with the actual response. I always begin the introduction with this opening. C'est une question très pertinente, surtout dans le contexte actuel où, and then I introduce the topic and give my personal opinion. That's basically all we need in the introduction. Paraphrasing the topic and give a balanced opinion. So my final introduction would be something like c'est une question très pertinente, surtout dans le contexte actuel où les technologies occupent une place très importante dans notre vie quotidienne. Personnellement, je pense que le téléphone portable est devenu presque indispensable aujourd'hui, même s'il présente certains inconvénients. And here is a small tip on the introduction in general based on my personal experience with language exams. Most of the time, it's much easier to agree with the main idea represented in the topic. For example, if the topic says that smartphone or AI has become indispensable in our lives, I would generally agree. Or for example, if the topic suggests reducing the number of cars in cities, I would probably say that this is a positive approach. Of course, there are exceptions, but agreeing with the topic usually makes it easier to develop ideas and to find supporting arguments. Moving on to the first argument, as you can see, there isn't much structure apart from a few connectors. I usually start with tout d'abord, then I introduce my first blueprint using en effet. After that, I add a short explanation and, whenever possible, an example. Personally, I always try to add at least one example to the first argument because examples makes the response sound more natural and more convincing. If I can't think of an example, I simply use a personal experience instead. So for this topic, my first argument would be tout d'abord, je pense que le téléphone portable facilite énormément la communication. En effet, il permet de rester en contact avec sa famille et ses amis à tout moment. Par exemple, lorsqu'une personne vit à l'étranger, elle peut facilement appeler ses proches grâce aux applications de messagerie. Cela permet de maintenir les relations malgré la distance. Once again, let's highlight a few useful expressions here. Rester en contact grâce aux applications de messagerie, maintenir les relations. These are very practical expressions that you can reuse in many topics related to technology, communication, family life, or even immigration. All right, now move on to the second argument. Just like before, there isn't a fixed structure. We simply start with a connector such as par ailleurs or ensuite and introduce a second blueprint. For example, we can say par ailleurs, le téléphone portable facilite énormément la vie quotidienne. On peut utiliser le GPS pour se déplacer, effectuer des paiements en ligne, consulter ses courriels ou encore accéder des informations importantes en quelques secondes. Cela permet d'être plus efficace, plus productif et de gagner plus de temps. Again, let's identify some useful vocabulary. For example, se déplacer, effectuer des paiements en ligne, consulter ses courriels, gagner du temps. These are exactly kinds of blueprints that can be reused whenever you are talking about smartphones, the internet, artificial intelligence, or technological process in general. Now let's take a look at the counter argument. If we go back to our template, we can see that the structure is almost always the same. We start with a connector that introduces contrast. I usually use cependant, and then we acknowledge a limitation. For example, cependant, il ne faut pas oublier que le téléphone portable présente aussi or comporte aussi certains inconvénients. And we can continue with une utilisation excessive peut créer une dépendance, réduire les interactions sociales face à face et parfois nuire à la concentration, surtout or notamment chez les jeunes. Then we can finish with a balanced statement like c'est pourquoi il est important de maintenir un équilibre et de l'utiliser avec modération. And honestly, this is the main idea behind most counter arguments. Now let's move on to the conclusion. As always, we start with en conclusion, je pense que même si, and then we briefly mention the limitation we introduce in the counter arguments before returning to our main opinion. For example, we can say en conclusion, je pense que même si le téléphone portable peut avoir quelques effets négatifs lorsqu'il est utilisé de manière excessive, il reste aujourd'hui un utile presque indispensable grâce aux nombreux avantages qu'il apporte, qu'il offre dans notre vie quotidienne, notre vie personnelle ou professionnelle. Now let's take a look at the complete response. At first glance, this paragraph may look long and a little intimidating, but now we can clearly see what's actually happening. Most of the structure was already prepared. The only thing we really had to create were two ideas, a couple of explanations, and maybe one example. That's why I keep insisting on blueprints. The stronger your collection of blueprints becomes, the easier task 3 gets. That's it for today's practice. I really hope that this method helps you as much as it helped me. Using this approach, I was able to reach a B2 level in about 7 months of self-study. To be honest, I still do not consider my overall French speaking skill to be a strong B2, but these strategies help me sound more confident and perform better on exam day. Of course, I was lucky enough to receive a topic that felt familiar, but that's the whole point. The more you practice before the exam, the higher the chances of receiving something familiar. So if you found this video helpful, please do not forget to subscribe and share this content with anyone who is preparing for TCF Canada exam. And as always, feel free to leave your feedback. I will adjust videos based on your comments, and do not hesitate to correct me whenever I make mistakes. This channel is part of my own French learning journey. And thank you for watching this video. I will see you in the next one.